Western Christians came to today's feast rather late. It was only made a feast in the Universal Church in the 15th century. And for many years, Western theologians omitted any mention of the Transfiguration. I'm open to being corrected by Father Dominic, but it does not feature in Peter Lombard's Sentences, the standard university theological text of the medieval period. And other theologians, if they do mention the Transfiguration, place it within the context of eschatology, as a demonstration of our future hopes for bodily glory at the end of time, or in a discussion of Christ's resurrection. St. Thomas sees the Transfiguration in part as a kind of antidote to the horrors of the Passion. In order that anyone go straight along a road, he says, they must have some knowledge of the end. Thus, an archer will not shoot the arrow straight unless he first sees the target. But by focusing on the resurrection alone as a target, by only seeing the Transfiguration as a kind of vaccine from the pains of the Passion, we overlook the two people who appear with Jesus. For if the resurrection was the only focus, we might suggest that Adam should have replaced Moses to make the transformation of the old Adam into the new Adam more clear. Elijah could be replaced by Ezekiel for his vision of the dry bones returning to life, or Isaiah with his vision of the suffering servant who is finally exalted. But in the lives of Moses and Elijah, we have some clue of the true meaning of Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection. In the struggles of Moses as leader of the people of Israel, we see more clearly the struggles of Christ. No sooner had the people of Israel left Egypt than they were hungering for what they had left behind there. While Moses was at the top of the mountain receiving the law, the people lapsed into idolatry. Given the gift of miraculous food, they soon grow tired of it and want something else. No sooner are they on the threshold of the promised land, they do not want to enter for fear of the inhabitants. All the way through this, Moses stands as their leader, the mediator between God and his people. He carries on himself the burden of a rebellious and stiff-necked people, a people in whom, if we're honest, we can sometimes see many of our own failings. The yoke which Moses bears as leader of God's people becomes, for Christ, the yoke of the cross. For he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement which made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. In Elijah, we find the enigmatic prophet who left no book of oracles, but whose deeds and fiery preaching are recorded in 1 and 2 Kings. While Elijah is the guardian of true religion against the darkness of idolatry in his prophetic ministry, with Christ we have the final answer to idolatry. For as the letter to the Hebrews says, he, Christ, reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature. In the light of the transfigured Christ, all of our idols crumble away. Elijah's question to the people of Israel at the top of Mount Carmel is asked definitively by Christ. How long will you go limping with two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. On Christ, then, falls both our rejection of God, that rejection we make of God by our sin, and also the idolatry which we can be guilty of when we create an image of God that suits our own sensibilities. Our misuse of our freedom, a misuse which ultimately does not free but rather enslaves us, is transformed by Christ's free acceptance of his passion. The response which Peter makes is telling. While in yesterday's gospel, a gospel you would have heard but for a technical hitch here, we had Peter's refusal to accept Christ's prediction of his own suffering and death, a rejection of Christ's suffering servitude. Peter now falls to the ground in front of the glory of the transfigured Lord. He realizes that when the Father commands us to listen to him, it is only by listening to Jesus, carrying out his commands, and imitating his actions, that our destiny will become that of our masters. That we must follow him to Calvary by doing battle against our sin, our disobedience, our idolatry, and so come to share his glory. Whereas for Moses and the people in the wilderness, there were 3 levels of diminishing holiness: God alone, God and Moses and the people. In the Transfiguration, we have the opening up into the fullness of holiness. The disciples and all of creation are immersed in the glory of the divinity flowing from Jesus. The delight that the Father takes in his beloved Son's obedience is present here and now in this moment of Trinitarian communion, a communion which the Son makes possible for us to share. It's no wonder then that Peter, who recounts the events of the Transfiguration in his first letter, recognizes that the Christian life is a sharing here and now in the divine nature by our election and obedience. So while the Transfiguration certainly shows us the hope of our future glory and allows us to see the cross more than simply as an agonizing death, it allows us to see how the work of our own redemption is worked out here and now in this passing world, a redemption which is both a fulfillment of the past and an ever new fresh start.